Something a lot of people don't know about me is that I love a good Western. There's just something about a man in a poncho standing against a bunch of bad guys with nothing but his trusty six-shooter that I can get behind every single time. And the only thing that could possibly make a good Western even better is by putting it in a fantasy series. So this week, I read The Gunslinger by Stephen King, which is the first book in the Dark Tower series. And if you've never heard of the Dark Tower series, I'm going to try my best to describe it. The Dark Tower series follows a man named Roland, who is the last gunslinger. He's the last of his kind. And he is on this journey to find and discover the Dark Tower, which sits at the nexus point of the entire Stephen King multiverse. And it is his destiny to try and find this thing. So over the course of 7 or 8 books, he goes on this mind-bending, world-hopping adventure where he meets a bunch of different people and he attempts to get to the Dark Tower. And this is one of those few fantasy series that I actually kind of knew something about before reading it. There's been a lot of fantasy series over the last, year or two that I kind of heard about, but I didn't know a lot about. And then there were fantasy series where I had never heard of them before in my entire life. But The Dark Tower has been a series that I've kind of heard about over the last several years, and people have recommended to me over the last several years because there's just nothing else out there like it. Fantasy has been dominated by a very specific kind of setting. And that setting is usually, middle-aged Europe, where, you got the knights and the princesses and the castles and, the old-fashioned politics with, the dragons and the dwarves and the elves and the goblins and all that. And that's kind of what I think fantasy usually is. That's what fantasy kind of is to most people, I think. But there is that rare author who attempts to do something not just different, but really, really different. And I think The Dark Tower is one of those series where an author, in this case Stephen King, attempted to not write another Lord of the Rings, not write another A Song of Ice and Fire, not write another Malazan, but write something that was completely unique to him and that spoke to him. And yes, it absolutely has some stuff that is inspired by, Lord of the Rings and other really big fantasy series. But what he manages to do here in this first book, The Gunslinger, is nothing short of amazing to me. Because this is, by far, the most unique first book in the series I've ever read. Guardians of the Moon can eat its heart out. Eye of the World doesn't exist. The Blade itself, who's ever heard of it? Fellowship of the Ring? Never even knew you. Because The Gunslinger is just different, man. It is this weird, wild wasteland adventure where we follow Roland as he tracks down the man in black over the course of 230 pages. I mean, this is a really short book. And yet, there is something about the way that King writes, and I have said this, and I'm going to say it again, that is just simply so effective and so different that he is an author unto himself. I don't hide the fact that since I've started reading King, he's become one of my favorites. And I think very shortly he will become my favorite of all time. But the man just has this ability to create incredibly unique settings and atmospheres and characters unlike anyone else. And he really, really puts that on display with the Gunslinger, because I think the Gunslinger is one of his earliest works, at least in his mind. You know, I think he originally started trying to write The Dark Tower when he was like 18 or 19 years old. This is before Carrie, this is before Salem's Lot, this is before The Shining, this was before everything that he wanted to write this fantasy series. You know, he had read Lord of the Rings and he sat down and he wanted to create his own fantasy series. And you know, it's been revised and reworked over the years, but the final product that he's created in this first book is just so original and so different and so unique and so fun and so like mind-bending and weird and just occult. Occult, I think, is a proper word to use here, that it's almost hard to describe, because I could tell you the exact plot of this book and it wouldn't really spoil anything because of how weird and different it is. You know, this is a pretty straightforward book, at least plot-wise. Roland is following the Man in Black to find the Dark Tower because he knows where the Dark Tower is, or he knows the next step on his quest to get to the Dark Tower, right? That is the general plot. But what happens in this book is just, it's weird and it's different, because it's got this like, it's got like Christianity, and it's got like this hint of other fantasy worlds, and it's got, you know, the real world, and it's got this kind of weird post-apocalyptic setting, and there's just this weird general vibe that occurs throughout the story that it's hard to nail down. I mean, you can figure out what the plot of this book is, but I have no idea why the world is the way it is. I have no idea why Roland is the way he is. I don't know why he wants to seek the Dark Tower. I don't know, you know, why he has to follow the Man in Black to do it. I don't know what this world is. I don't know what the Dark Tower is. I know what it is conceptually, but I don't actually know what it is. And, you know, you kind of start figuring out what the Gunslinger is, and you kind of start figuring out Roland's backstory, but there are so many hints and so many things that King he just throws out there for you to look at. And every single thing he throws out there is what you want to learn more about. And it has been a really long time since I've read a book where an author will mention something about the world or the lore, and I immediately immediately want to go, what is that? What is that? What is that? I want answers now. I want to read the next book so I can figure out what he's referring to, because the only person privy to all the information in the world is Roland himself, and he's not talking. So you as the reader are trying to figure out what exactly is going on with everything that's happening in the story, and it's so wrapped in mystery, and it's so like self-contained, and it's so just weird and different, but it's brilliant because there's this sense of atmosphere and grit and weird post-apocalyptic monsters, and there's demons, and there's just this general vibe. That is really what I can say about the Gunslinger, is that it has a very distinct vibe that is unlike anything else I've ever read. You know, people say, oh, Malazan's different. Malazan, it doesn't answer your questions. The Gunslinger does not answer your questions. There is nothing but questions in this book. And you know what? I love it. I love how obscure and weird and just unique this is. And the fact that, you know, a lot of people bounce off the first one, I feel is a great disservice to the rest of the series. I haven't even read it yet, but I think it's a great disservice to this book, and it's a great disservice to this series, because what I think King is doing here in this first book, and what I imagine he'll do with the rest, is it's just different. And it's incredibly imaginative. And it caused me to be curious about the rest of the series. It caused me to say, I can't wait to read the rest of this. And I think if a first book in a series can make me do that, it makes me want to question It makes me want to read the lore. It makes me want to continue to read the series and read it as quickly as possible so I can get that information inside me. Then I think that's just a great thing to me. You know what I mean? Like there are just so few fantasy books out there where I can truly say it captivated my imagination completely. I mean, this is a short book, but I read this in a day, and I burned through it. Like every single chapter, every single section, every single page, every single word made me want to read the next. And that is just so different than anything else I've ever read. And I just, I'm just blown away by how good this was. There are some faults. Don't get me wrong. The character work is not the best. You begin to see the world building, but you don't really know what any of it means. And it's very mysterious, and it's very weird. And, it almost feels like a fever dream to read. So those things kind of work against it. But for me, I like that. I like that it's weird. I like that it's different. I like that it's so short and so precise, and King doesn't waste a single page. He just puts you in it. He shows you some stuff. He gets some ideas. And then you're at the end of the book and you're thinking, well, I want to read another. So, yeah. If you couldn't tell, I really like The Gunslinger. I really enjoyed this. It was so unique. This was so different. And I wish I had the mental capacity to properly describe this first book. But I think that's kind of what King is going for. He wants you to stutter. He wants you to go, what is this? He wants you to go, this is weird and this is different. And I'm not even sure how entirely to feel about this. I think that's what King's goal was. And honestly, I think he nails it out of the park. This is just a really fun book. I can't wait to read more, genuinely, because it was just a great time. I'm going to give it an 8.2 to 8.5 out of 10. It's a great introduction to this series. I can't wait to read the rest. I'm ecstatic. I think The Dark Tower is going to be one of my favorite series by the end. I'm calling it now because of how much this first book impressed me. I've never read anything like this, and that is a huge compliment. So, yeah, The Gunslinger is excellent. Please give it a go. It's weird. Just know it's weird, but it's weird in a good way.